Right, welcome back. The first set of speakers started this process of reframing our security priorities, examining the record and dealing with a broad array of challenges. And the discussion included a look at traditional security concerns, the economy, the environment, human rights, and other issues. But we're not just here to reframe the questions, we're here also to try and reframe, in fact, the solutions that people have been providing to these problems so far. This is not to criticize the earlier part at all. Many were proposed, but just to remind ourselves of what we're here for. Dr. Pachauri provided a very thought-provoking account of his group's assessment of climate change. Doubtless that will be discussed, but at least we have the official version for people to start with. Now we're going to look more closely at the current balance between traditional defense and the new challenges. I'm going to turn the floor over to Ambassador Charles Freeman, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. Charles.
Thank you, Francis, and good morning, everyone. Now, more than ever, security is an obsession in the United States. This is both natural after 9/11 and strange. We once faced the threat of national annihilation 17 minutes after someone in Moscow turned a key. Now there's no basis to fear Armageddon, yet we're fearful and in search of more perfect security. We spent a lot of money blundering about in West Asia on a quest for safety from foreign assault. As a result, chronic budgetary imbalances and debt are now the greatest identifiable dangers to our future. Perhaps we should heed Will Rogers, who suggested a constitutional amendment to ban new wars until we've paid for the last ones. In many respects, we face lessened threats, but feel more menaced. If America were a person, not a nation, we could call a shrink. But there's none available, and if there were, we might not now be able to pay his bill. This suggests that it's time to start thinking. Those who can no longer live by their wallets or their brawn must learn to live by their wits. There seems to be mounting agreement that the greatest threats to America may be our own fiscal foolishness, political paralysis, and promiscuous military impulses. In the opening years of this century, we have in many ways debased the values that define us as a nation. A lot of people think that to get our groove back, we need to get our act together, or perhaps it's the other way around. In our foreign policies, some say we suffer from enemy deprivation syndrome, a strategy deficit, and delusions of leadership. We became accustomed to protecting others during the Cold War. That's our thing, and we want to keep doing it even when neither we nor our allies can begin to describe what it is we now propose to protect them from. In some ways, we didn't really need allies in the good old days when we planned for a nuclear war in Europe. Now we've got conventional capacity shortfalls and would welcome a bit of help from our friends. But they seem unconvinced that we know who needs protection from what, and happy to remain the beneficiaries rather than the builders of military muscle. This raises a question or two. Is peace in Europe a serious military problem? How do we do more with less when those to whom we're committed plan also to do less? Our rising powers in Asia, engines of growth we can ride to greater prosperity, or military rivals to be opposed or manipulated? Is the use of force really the only way by which to communicate with the Islamic world? If we must intervene militarily, can we do so more ergonomically? Are the military buildups and arms races of the past now yielding to those of the future? Meanwhile, our domestic political gridlock has helped produce a serious crisis of global governance. Human acts of commission, omission, and emission threaten to finish the job of destroying the Garden of Eden God gave us when he or she entrusted us with this blue-green gem of a planet. What do we as a species and as a country do about the security of our environment, energy supplies, and other foundations of our well-being as the demand for natural resources escalates and supplies tighten? Here to discuss some of these questions and many others related to the theme of affordable security is a most distinguished panel of experts. They are women and men with diverse perspectives and opinions, and I'm going to call them in the order on the program to speak for about 10 minutes each. I will attempt, if possible, by means short of the use of force, to hold them to that limit, but all options remain on the table. I'd like first to call Linda Bilmes, who is a professor at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, co-author, as you heard earlier today, with Joe Stiglitz of an epical study on the costs of the Iraq War and Afghanistan wars. She's an expert on U.S. budgeting and public finance. She's written on financial and budgetary issues, not just on the Iraq War, but on veterans' health and disability costs and the implications of these for our national future. Linda?
Thank you, Ambassador. Good morning to you all. When we think about the affordable security and the balance between traditional defense and new challenges, we need to recognize that we have a significant challenge that comes not from new security threats or environmental developments, but rather from simply coping with the legacy of the conflicts that we have already fought. And this legacy will pose an economic and financial burden and constrain our choices in the years to come. So in that respect, I thought I would focus this morning on 3 points. First, to look a little bit at the magnitude of the long-term war costs that we will have to pay in the U.S. for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Secondly, specifically the financial implications of this for the defense budget. And third, some ways we might address this situation going forward. One of the many tragedies of war is the fact that the costs, not only financial, of course, but the economic, the political, human costs, go on for decades after the war is fought. And for example, and this is just one example, let's see if how this works. Is it working? Oops. There we go. The cost of caring for veterans who fought in the wars peaks 30 to 40 years after a war is finished. For example, the peak year for paying disability benefits to World War I veterans came in 1969. And for World War II veterans, it was in the mid-70s. For the Vietnam War, it's expected to be in 2020. It's still rising. And we pay $25 billion per year today. That's half the State Department budget for Vietnam veteran disability benefits. And even the first Gulf War in 1991, we're paying about $5 billion a year. That's twice the National Parks budget in disability compensation for the first Gulf War in 1991, even though that was a war that lasted for a few weeks. Now, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars will be the most expensive in U.S. history. The eventual cost will reach between $4 and $6 trillion. And a large portion of that has not been paid yet. Of the 2.2 million U.S. troops who have deployed, 1.4 million have returned to date. And already of those who have discharged, nearly 50% have already applied for disability compensation that they will be entitled to. More than 50% have already been treated by the Veterans Department for medical care. And all of the active duty military who are involved in the defense TRICARE system have been vastly increasing the utilization, driving up significantly the cost of the DoD healthcare system. If you think about it a different way, we can also think about the fact that the money that we have spent to date, that's already spent, which is close to $2 trillion, has been entirely borrowed. And that means that we've put at least $2 trillion onto the national debt. Another way to think about it, if you go to a Tea Party conference, for example, they count in terms of the amount of debt per American, which has doubled from $25,000 to more than $50,000 in the past few years, and about 6,000 of that is directly attributable to the way that we have financed these conflicts. And of course that will go up significantly as interest rates rise. The legacy of these wars will have repercussions for the U.S. budget, and particularly for the resources that are available for traditional core defense functions. And I will just show you one example. But for example, if we think about the traditional military budget of the Pentagon, that has been about between 18 and 19% of the total U.S. budget spending for the past several years. It has remained pretty flat. But if we look ahead to 2017, that is forecast to shrink. However, if you look closely, the fastest growing component of the defense budget is the military healthcare system, which is growing much faster than any other federal healthcare system. And if this continues, if it continues to grow at anything close to the 11% that it is growing at right now, this will essentially produce a shrinking amount of an already shrinking defense budget available for core military functions. And what the chart shows you there is that if this kind of rate of growth in military health care continues, the percentage of the U.S. budget that is devoted to core military functions will shrink from about 18% now to about 10% in the next few years, a really staggering figure. All of this is background to the question we are asked today: are there ways to achieve security and peace with fewer resources? And I would argue that there are two critical changes that must be introduced to make these trade-offs more wisely. First, we absolutely must develop better transparency over what wars cost. Right now, we cannot account for where the money goes. The long-term costs, even the ones that we know are inevitable, don't exist anywhere in the government accounts. The result is that when we budget for war, when we appropriate money for war, we're only appropriating for a small fraction of the true cost. And of course, this makes it appear that war is cheaper and makes it much easier to go to war. Second, the systems that are supposed to track spending, prevent profiteering, control corruption, don't work. The Pentagon flunks its audit every year and has for 20 years. It's the only government organization that has not managed to achieve a clean financial audit. The SPOT system, the Synchronized Pre-Deployment Operational Tracker, which is supposed to track spending, does not work. It undercounted $4 billion last year. The system for tracking U.S. contracts to non-U.S. vendors in Afghanistan doesn't work. We supposedly track we do track all contracts over $100,000, but surprisingly, 75% of all contracts are for less than $100,000. In fact, a surprisingly large number are for $99,000. The sixth largest federal Pentagon contractor, if you tracked it this way, after Boeing and Lockheed and so forth, is essentially the category of miscellaneous foreign contractors. Thousands of contracts on which there is no information at all. The Commission on Wartime Contracting said that we've wasted, very conservatively, $60 billion in Iraq and Afghanistan. The point is that this, unlike many problems in the world, is really not an impossible, not even a difficult problem to solve. Fortune 500 companies keep track of their costs. Complicated government organizations like New York City and Washington, D.C., where I've been involved personally, have instituted cost accounting systems to actually be able to track where money goes. But it's a slow 5-year process. The Pentagon has taken the approach that they can lose weight by cutting off their arm, which does lose weight, but it also creates other problems. And what I'm proposing is a 5-year diet, which is hard, tedious, difficult to do, but actually is necessary. Third, if we are going to reduce the militarization of our foreign policy and rely more on diplomacy, we must invest in the human capital to achieve this. Right now, we supposedly have more musicians in the military than foreign service officers. Though, of course, we don't really know because, of course, we have no way to track how many musicians we have in the military. But we do know that in the State Department, for example, there is a high attrition rate of young foreign service officers because the diplomatic corps has not kept up with the times. It has not been able to accommodate two-career families, and young people don't want to stamp visas for 6 years after they get their PhD. The chart that I've showed you up there, which comes from my most recent book, The People Factor, Strengthening America by Investing in Public Service, shows you that in a survey of 2,000 college students from top 4-year colleges, the things that the students say that they most want in a job, which are in the lower right-hand quadrant, they believe, which are things like wanting an organization that really cares about people like me, and an organization where I can rise to the top on merit. They think that those criteria apply much more to the private sector than to the public sector. And if we don't change the structure of the civil service in this country and in many countries around the world to be able to attract and retain and mentor the best and the brightest, we will not be able to have the kind of diplomacy and soft power that we want. These issues, the shrinking share of resources that will be available for traditional defense, the lack of budget transparency, the need for better accounting systems and tracking systems, and the need to invest in human capital. None of these sound very glamorous, but they are all critical to being able to do more with less and to being able to achieve better outcomes with fewer resources in the years ahead.
Thank you very much. Might begin with an audit of the Pentagon, which I understand it's amazing. This is a huge part of the federal budget. It's never been audited. It's unauditable. Second panelist is Bates Gill, not Bill Gates. Bates Gill is an expert on Chinese foreign policy, and at present he is the director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. He's just been named, or it's been announced that in a few months he will go to head the U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney in Australia, which is very much SIPRI's loss and Australia's gain. Bates's writing and research over the years covers both global and regional issues, and to the dismay of many and the delight of a few, he displays a higher regard for the facts than the conventional wisdom on these matters. So I expect the quality of the security dialogue in the Pacific to go up as he moves to Sydney. Bates.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much. May I have the next slide, please? There we are. I'm going to bring up just two main points here. First, I want to just use this slide to give us some sense of the overall trends in military spending around the world and place the U.S. Military spending in that context. And then, secondly, to ask and try to briefly answer the big question we're talking about on this panel and throughout the next 2 days. What are we buying with our security dollars? Are we spending them in the right direction? How, in an age of increasingly austere budgets, can we get the security we need and the security we can afford. As I say, this is a very simple graphic, but I just want to draw your attention to three main points. What we're showing here is where military spending was in these top 10 countries 10 years ago and where it is today. The first point then to draw from this is the very top blue circles represent the United States. We see a massive increase over the course of that 10-year period, and of course an increase which far dwarfs all the other major spenders in military terms across the rest of the world. So that's point one. U.S. is huge. It is larger in military spending than the next 14 countries combined. Significant. Even as we go into a period of shrinking budgets, the United States will remain far and away the largest military spender in the world. That's one important point. A second one, and I'm sorry it's a little bit difficult to see this, but the second major point is to look at who's growing other than the United States. And these are not our allies. These are not what we would traditionally term our friends, but rather developing world countries, often in Asia or in the Middle East. Of course, the second figure there is China, which over that period has nearly tripled its military spending. Others with significant growth there we can point to would include Russia, India, Saudi Arabia. The third point to draw from this graph, I think, or this graphic, is the flattening and even shrinking of military spending amongst our allies around the world, and in particularly in Europe. Europe is going through a significant downsizing of its military spending and indeed its military capacity, which was so readily seen in the course of the recent Libyan campaign. But this is a steady trend that's been ongoing for at least 10 years and is likely to continue, going out to at least 2018 and probably even beyond. In fact, NATO Europe, I should say the European members of NATO today are spending in their military spending in constant dollars what they were spending in 2002. And that number is going to continue to go down. I heard a remarkable story yesterday at another conference, just one interesting example. The Netherlands took the decision to simply do away with all of its armored capacity. Get rid of it. They don't have any armored capacity anymore in the Netherlands. Maybe that's a wise decision, but it was certainly not undertaken in any sort of strategic way. And across NATO, across our NATO allies, and including across the Atlantic with the United States and Canada, there simply isn't a strategy in place. It's really the finance ministers who are driving these decisions on the basis of austerity measures, debt reduction, etc., with very, very little regard, in fact, for military strategy going forward, and certainly not in regard to coordination with their other allies and friends in Europe and here in the United States. So the point that I would draw from that is that even as we in the United States are reducing military spending and seeking to come up with an affordable security formula, the shift from the debate of burden sharing with our NATO friends has moved precipitously towards what might be called burden shedding, with expectations being increasingly placed upon our friends in Europe to assume burdens that they're simply not going to assume. This has to be a part, I would think, of our calculus as we move away, I would hope, from a predominantly militarized approach to dealing with our challenges abroad, with an expectation that we can lead friends to come with us in these militarized undertakings. We're going to have to be far more realistic because they're not coming next time. They're just not. And even if they did, we should have very low expectations of their capacity to engage these challenges in a military sense in the way that we might like. So when you come to this, I think, very stark realization about the way we spend our money and our what must be lowered expectations of what our friends and allies are likely to do with us from a military point of view, it really does force us to ask the questions we're asking here. What are we buying? What threat are we trying to address? It's not clear even now, under current trends, that we're able to carry out 1.5 or 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, let alone be prepared to fight a serious regional conflict with a serious potential adversary such as Iran or even North Korea or, God help us, in Eastern Europe, let alone the possibility that we might escalate into a confrontation and possible war with a really major power such as China. We have to change our thinking. We need to significantly rethink the threats that we're facing and become, of course, smarter in an age of diminishing military assets and raise the salience and importance and profile within our strategy of non-military means for assuring our security. I'll close in the last couple of minutes I have here by trying to put forward what I hope will be useful terms in our lexicon as we think about the future and how we want to afford our security. 3 terms that I don't think we hear enough of, and I'm hopeful that coming out of this conference we'll hear a lot more of going forward. First, flow security. I think Joe Stiglitz made some mention of this today. The threats that we face of a security nature, I think, will be increasingly those which can disrupt the flows that undergird the fundamental systems which shape and sustain our planet and our way of life. The threats to ecosystems, the threats to our technological connectedness, and the threats to effective governance. If we can think in terms of the flows which sustain us and the need to protect them from disruption, that would make a big step, I would think, towards affordable security. And many of these forms of protection have nothing whatsoever to do with traditional military means. Secondly, agility. We've heard the term phrased in a different way by many of our speakers already. Adaptation. We have to be smarter and willing to adapt because we're going to have some shocks that are not military shocks necessarily, but are rather shocks to these fundamental systems that sustain our way of life. We need to be better prepared for them, and we need to be quick in responding to them. And then lastly, the term I think is very useful, and which really has come to define, I would say, a European approach to understanding security, and that's the term resilience. Our ability as a species, as a country, as humans, to absorb shocks that we are going to face, but then to rebound from them more quickly and hopefully more strongly. If we can think of these terms, flow security, agility, and resilience, as being cornerstones for an approach to affordable, less militarized approach to our security in the future, I'm hopeful that we will make the proper gains then going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bates. Andrew Bacevich is a professor of international relations at Boston University and a retired career officer in the United States Army. He's written extensively on the American propensity to attempt military solutions to international problems in the post-Cold War era, rather than non-military solutions, and the lessons we should learn from the results of these experiments. Andrew?
Well, thank you very much. I have no slides, no charts, no data. What I want to do very briefly, however, is to reflect with you on the yawning gap between what we Americans have expected of war and what war has actually produced. The end of the Cold War, and perhaps in particular Operation Desert Storm back in 1991, found Americans succumbing to a certain military utopianism. The essence of that utopianism reduced to this: the conviction that the United States military had figured out how to win wars. The traditional view of war as fraught with risk and uncertainty no longer applied, at least to the United States. And by extension, the efficacy of force as an instrument of policy was greatly enhanced, again, at least for the United States. Here's an influential Air Force officer expounding on the implications of Operation Desert Storm back in the 1990s. The methods employed in that war by the U.S. forces against Iraq, he wrote, were making it possible not just to impede the means of the enemy to conduct war or the will of the people to continue war, but the very ability of the enemy to control its vital functions. War, he continued, as waged by the United States, could become, as a consequence of these methods, could become quick, tidy, and above all, predictable. That's a professional military officer. Similarly, here's an extract from U.S. Army Field Manual 100-7, also drafted in the wake of Operation Desert Storm. The title of this manual is Decisive Force. And here's the vision of warfare described again by professional military officers back in the 1990s. Whenever the Army is called upon, says this manual, it fights to win and operates to achieve decisive results at minimum cost of life and treasure. Army forces in combat seek to impose their will on the enemy. In this regard, the text continues, the commander's challenge is to shape the military environment and set the conditions for decisive results or victory, unqualified success in all major operations, whether in peacetime conflict or war. And finally, there's this. The intent, the commander's intent, is to concentrate strategically the decisive force, simultaneously destroying and disrupting key enemy capabilities and functions and exploiting the resultant strategic advantage and initiative before the enemy can react, achieving the theater's strategic objectives while striving to incur minimum casualties is the measure of success. That's what the officer corps thought about war back in the 1990s. After 9/11, such expectations informed both political and military thinking about what the so-called global war on terror, how it would be fought, and how it would unfold. And to a considerable degree, initial operations in Afghanistan and Iraq supported such expectations and reinforced the reigning precepts of military utopianism. Here, for example, is a U.S. Army three-star general testifying before a Senate subcommittee in 2004. We envision, he said, we envision the future from an information age perspective when operations are conducted in a battle space, not a battlefield. We are now able to create decision superiority that is enabled by network systems, new sensors, and command and control capabilities that are producing unprecedented near real-time situational awareness. Combined, these capabilities will leverage information dominance, speed, and precision, and result in decision superiority. Again, that's a three-star Army officer speaking in the wake of the first year or so of the Iraq War. All of this, of course, turned out to be bunk. What we have learned, what we ought to have learned over the past decade at enormous cost, is that the essential nature of war remains unchanged and is about as controllable as a forest fire. U.S. forces have proven unable to win in any meaningful sense. Indeed, they have struggled simply to terminate that which they began. The Air Force officer's vision of war as quick, tidy, and above all predictable was an illusion. FM 100-7's expectations that the Army will achieve, quote, unqualified success in all major operations, thereby imposing its will on the enemy, proved to be several bridges too far. And the Army 3-star's description of a force that will, quote, leverage information, dominance, speed, and precision to achieve decision superiority turned out to be so much blather. Well, what should we be doing? I mean, there are those in this city, I think, who would argue that we need to try harder, that we need to try again. I think that's wrong. It seems to me that the great military lesson of the past decade, certainly not learned by those in this city clamoring to have a go at Iran, the great lesson is that common sense dictates that war should once again be a last resort, employed only when the nation's most vital interests are at stake. Any other approach is madness, which describes U.S. military policy since 9/11. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that reminder that wars don't end until the defeated admit defeat. They don't end when you proclaim that you've won. And now for something different. Michael Klare. Not totally different, but on a slightly different topic, but very relevant to this issue of affordable security. Michael is a professor of peace and world security at studies at Hampshire College, also teaches at Amherst and Smith and Mount Holyoke and the University of Massachusetts, and he serves as the defense correspondent of The Nation magazine. His many books address the geopolitics of energy and the American way of war and a variety of related topics, and he's actually interrupting a book tour to join us here today. His latest book, The Race for What's Left, is just out. Michael.
Thank you. I do have a few slides, and I'm going to talk about what causes conflict in the current world and brings us to the... Won't be much of anything without that. What brings us to this point? And I want to argue that I fear that the big worry is that conflict could be triggered by competition for scarce resources. And I worry about that for several reasons. One, growing demand for resources being driven by rising population and the fact that we have greater demand than ever before with the rise of new economic powers, China, India, and other countries in the developing world, at the same time that many resources are, if not becoming scarce, are simply not growing fast enough to meet rising demand. But that has to be added to something else, which is the tendency of states, including United States, to securitize resources that are considered essential to national security. And it could be oil, it could be water, and therefore are considered legitimate reasons for going to war. Andrew just said that we go to war over vital national security issues. This country has deemed oil to be a matter of national security over which it's legitimate to go to war. Right now, the most dangerous place in the world is the Strait of Hormuz. Why? Because it is considered by this country to be a matter of national security to keep that flow of oil through that narrow channel safe from any obstruction. The Iranians have threatened to block that. There's a whole lot of other issues around the Iranian threat, nuclear weapons, but that's also tied to the historic struggle for dominance in the Persian Gulf area. And ever since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when President Carter was in power, he made it very clear that any attempt by a hostile power to obstruct the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world would be considered a threat to the national security of the United States and would be opposed by any means necessary, including military force. And Iran is the current possible target of that action. To implement the Carter Doctrine, President Carter created a new military organization, which today we call the U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM, which is active in 2 wars right now, in Iraq and Afghanistan. But its original intent, as defined by President Carter, was to keep the flow of oil safe through the Persian Gulf, and it retains that mission today. And the Carter Doctrine and CENTCOM was used initially by President Reagan during the Iran-Iraq War, when the U.S. intervened to keep the tankers safe from Iranian threats, a conflict we forget in this country pretty largely, but not in Iran. The First Persian Gulf War, which we've heard about, also defined in terms reminiscent of the Carter Doctrine by the first President Bush. I'm going through these quickly because I want to get to the more current developments. But even the invasion of Iraq, which is highly contested what the causes of it were, I think you cannot separate that from the legacy of the Carter Doctrine, the First Persian Gulf War, and the belief that among American policymakers that we cannot allow a hostile power to dominate the Persian Gulf region. Saddam Hussein was viewed in those terms and had to be eliminated one way or another. And even today, President Obama has more or less said the same thing, that the Straits of Hormuz have to be kept free, and any threat in line with the Carter Doctrine will be opposed militarily. Now, some say that because U.S. oil production is rising through various techniques that many of us consider highly dangerous because of the techniques being used and the threat to the water supply of this country, hydrofracking. Nonetheless, these techniques are increasing domestic oil production, making it possible to reduce our oil imports from the dangerous areas. So maybe this is an argument for reducing our military reliance on the Middle East. Hopefully so. Nonetheless, the U.S. will continue to rely on imported oil. That is not something that can be eliminated. Moreover, the competition for oil with China is going to become much more fierce in the decades ahead. As you could see from the diagram, China's oil imports are very soon going to overtake American imports of oil. And this is going to lead to intense competition for the supply that's available. And this is at a time, this is again something that's highly controversial, and maybe we could get into discussion about it later, but this is a very powerful chart from the International Energy Agency in Paris showing the bottom blue on that diagram is the oil output from known existing, from producing fields. And you could see a dramatic decline. 75% of existing oil fields will disappear over the next 25 years. And everything that's going to follow is yet to be discovered or yet to be developed. In the Arctic, deep offshore, in countries now at war. I believe this is highly questionable and dubious that any of this will materialize. Some of it will, but a lot of it is very questionable for reasons I don't have time to discuss. But there will lead, therefore, for intense competition. This diagram shows that on the left side, the major consumers of oil are ones with very little domestic oil supplies of their own. The ones that have oil are that have oil to export are few in number, highly concentrated in a few countries, and these countries are the subject of intense diplomatic pursuit by the major oil consumers, the U.S., China, also Japan and the EU countries, desperate to get access to those handful of countries. That's understandable, that's perfectly fine, but many of these diplomatic pursuits are accompanied by arms transfers, military assistance, military intelligence support in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf area, and increasingly in Africa. And not that the U.S. and China are seeking to promote violence in those areas, but the net result of the arms diplomacy in pursuit of energy of the U.S. and China and other countries is to increase the potential for violence in China, in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Central Asia, where the flow of arms is increasing as a result of all of this. Both the U.S. and China are also increasing their ability to project power into the areas with the creation of the Africom in 2007, the first overseas new military command since the Central Command was created, and China with the expansion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has a increasing military dimension tied to energy security. In my few minutes left, I want to emphasize the importance of geography in all of this. Not only the use of arms as a form of diplomacy, but growing disputes over offshore territories that are disputed, that hold energy, like the East China Sea, which was a site of conflict a year ago, and especially the South China Sea, which worries me in particular because this, in my view, is the second most dangerous area in the world after the Strait of Hormuz, because China has asserted its claim to the entire area, but it's also contested by China, by Vietnam, by Malaysia, and Brunei, all claiming parts of the area and a wish to develop its undersea oil and gas. Now the United States, President Obama has asserted that the U.S. will support those countries in their efforts to assert their claims with China. And now, under the new military plan announced by President Obama in January, the South China Sea is going to be the center of gravity of America's post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan military policy. And so I think this becomes a very dangerous area with a risk of incidents at sea escalating. I won't talk about the Caspian Sea, but there's similar dangers there. Just to conclude, if we want to reduce the risk of conflict, we have to take steps to demilitarize the pursuit of resources. And I spoke about oil, but everything I say is equally true of water. If we're talking about the Middle East, if we're talking about Israel and Jordan and neighboring countries, if we're talking about Egypt and the upstream countries on the Nile River, the Tigris and the Euphrates, Iraq and its upstream countries, the same is true. We have to demilitarize these, demilitarize the pursuit of resources. We have to promote alternative sources of energy, as we heard earlier, promote cooperation in the development of resources and alternative sources of energy, and try as much as possible to solve these offshore territorial disputes and disputes over disputed water basins. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think as an addendum to that, Michael, you probably would agree that some of the environmental, global climate change, global warming issues undoubtedly run the risk of becoming heavily militarized in the future.
Absolutely.
So even as we try to demilitarize existing sources of conflict, we may face new ones where the temptation will be to use force against large flows of refugees from Bangladesh to India, for example, not out of the realm of possibility. We have, what, about 10 minutes? How much? Oh, we do. Wonderful. In that case, since nobody wants to hear anything that I have to say, I would like to suggest that we go directly to a discussion between those of you in the audience and the various panelists. And I would ask you please to say who you are and also direct your question, if you can, or comment, brief comment, to one of the panelists. Who would like to go first? Yes, ma'am. There's a microphone coming to you.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I just want to make a point about the military and energy and the environment. During the Bush years, energy was a forbidden topic at the Defense Department. And I ended up creating a salon at my house. And out of that, we got a line that went into Bush's State of the Union. The nation has a problem. We're addicted to oil, and we could start focusing on energy and defense because it's the single largest buyer of fuel in the entire world. I need help on this, which is we're now getting a lot of criticism from the Hill because the Defense Department is spending a lot of effort on trying to develop alternatives to oil. How do you deal with that kind of political complaint where the Department of Energy is not a user and they spend money to put out some contracts, but the Department of Defense really depends on this? So where do we find an educated political will to allow them to do it rather than forcing them to cut that budget?
Who's going to play Demosthenes, right? Michael, you wanted to comment?
You know, I've had the privilege of lecturing on this at the National War College and the National Defense University, and I know that the people in the military are very concerned. And, you know, I think they should be saying to people on the Hill that they're not going to be able to carry out their assigned mission if they don't proceed with these projects, because they understand that the way the military, the trajectory that the military has been on since World War II is that each new generation of weapons uses about 10 times more oil than the previous generation. And if they went down that path, and what I said is true, they will be unable to carry out their mission. They will not be able to fight a war in Afghanistan. Again, it was practically impossible to do that in this war, getting oil to the forces there. So they should say that, you know, this is the only way they'll be able to carry out their mission in the future.
A couple of points. Maybe I will add something. First, the Department of Defense is the largest single consumer of energy in our country.
In the world.
In the world.
In the world.
Thank you. And second, about 40% of our industrial production now, is less than 10% of our GDP at the moment. 40% of that is military connected. So the answer to your question may come through military Keynesianism. In a declining economy, you increase the defense budget to produce more. I don't happen to think that's a good solution, but I've heard people seriously argue for that. Yes, sir.
No, she was going to answer.
Oh, sorry, you're going to...
I was just going to say that the cost of oil, the cost of oil in fuel-related things in Afghanistan, for example, is about 25% of what we spend. Between 25 and 28% of the cost in Afghanistan per month is fuel-related. And in Iraq, one of the main reasons that costs went up from $4 billion per month to $16 billion per month was that during that same period, oil went up from $25 a barrel to $140 a barrel. But one of the problems with the lack of transparency on sort of defense spending is the fact that those numbers are not readily apparent. They need to be created. So if you actually had the means to be able to look without spending a year doing the research and see that 28% of all spending in Afghanistan was to fuel-related purposes, which means money spent to oil producers, money spent to oil companies, and look at where actually U.S. taxpayer money is going. I mean, I think that would help in the project of promoting what you are absolutely right as is the fact that within the Pentagon there is now a willingness to embrace the reach for renewable, you know, and alternative energies, but it's sort of invisible.
Yeah.
Yesterday, General John Allen,
Want to say, tell us who you are.
Bill
sir.
Goodfellow, the Center for International Policy. Yesterday, General John Allen spoke at Brookings and gave a very upbeat Pollyannish view. He's a 4-star, 3 master's degrees, admittedly not one from Boston University, but a very, very smart guy. And he just talked about the success, and they gave all these very upbeat metrics, and the word negotiated solution never came across his lips. And what he was talking about was a 10-year security agreement we're negotiating to keep us in Afghanistan for another decade. Now, it's really hard to understand. I mean, they're, you know, particularly Andy. Don't you talk to these guys? The generals, or they're clearly not listening to you. There's an enormous disconnect in this city, and the war. We talk about the war is past, but the Afghanistan war, we're talking about another decade of involvement. What's going on?
Well, I don't talk to these people. I mean, just because I was once a serving officer doesn't mean that I have I'm engaged in some kind of a dialogue with those who are currently on active duty. I'm just not. And, you know, you have to empathize, I think, a little bit with General Allen. I mean, he has a mission. And I would interpret his mission as finding some way to extricate us from Afghanistan in such a way that the day after the last American soldier leaves, that whoever happens to be president can then make a speech arguing that it was not an utter and catastrophic failure. So I sympathize with him. I think that the larger issue is one that, in a sense, was implicit in Mike's presentation, where he began all the way back at, in a sense, the original sin of this entire enterprise, which was the Carter Doctrine, to my mind, which really posited that, as the Carter Doctrine was subsequently interpreted and enlarged, I wouldn't blame Carter for that, but really posited that through the use of American hard power, we were going to be able to shape and determine the destiny of a very large part of the world. Initially defined as the Persian Gulf, after 9/11 defined as the Greater Middle East. And that project, which began with a relatively modest application of American military resources, has expanded over the years, over the decades, and produced precious little. We have not produced stability in the region. If anything, we've planted the seeds for greater instability. And the question that this is not a matter for the General Allens of the world to address. It's a matter for our political leaders to address. When are we going to acknowledge that we are not going to be able to determine the fate of 1.4 billion Muslims? We don't have the wisdom, we don't have the will, we don't have the wallet, and therefore there are the most fundamental questions very much need to be asked, and there seems to be precious willingness among our political leaders or opinion shapers even to permit those questions to be posed.
I think you could ask the question, negotiate about what? Because a negotiation which was directed at the original purpose of our going to Afghanistan, which was to deny it as a safe haven to terrorists with global reach, is a negotiation that the Taliban would be willing to undertake. A negotiation about who's going to rule Afghanistan with us as the negotiator is one they're not going to undertake. So I think we need to think through the question of why we're there, which seems to have changed over the years. Yes, please.
Medea Benjamin with Code Pink. I wonder what you think of our government's move towards a war on the cheap by using drone warfare, and especially since it's in the hand of such unaccountable agencies like the CIA and JSOC, and also what you think of the global proliferation of weaponized drones.
Who would like to take that?
Well, I can take a whack at it. I mean, I am impressed by the way that this enterprise that we once called the global war on terror has evolved. And I think that reflecting back over the course of a decade plus, it really has evolved in three very distinctive chapters. And chapter one we might call liberation. Liberation was based on the expectation that the shock and awe formula of war, the one I was sort of describing, would enable us fairly quickly and economically to either liberate or dominate the greater Middle East. That fell apart in Iraq. And by 2006, I think we had entered Chapter 2. Chapter 2, if Chapter 1 is liberation, Chapter 2 is pacification. If the principal figure in Chapter 1 is Rumsfeld, the principal figure in Chapter 2 is David Petraeus, who offered counterinsurgency as a formula for at least restabilizing that which we had destabilized. And although it's to some degree contested, I think, one could argue that he achieved a semblance of success in that regard in Iraq. So much so that in the wake of Petraeus's supposed success in Iraq, there were voices suggesting that counterinsurgency, or COIN, now provided a formula to be applied throughout the region. People talked of G-COIN, global counterinsurgency. This is the new American way of war. And indeed, when President Obama dispatched General McChrystal to Afghanistan back in 2009 with the expectation that McChrystal would be another Petraeus, the plan McChrystal conceived of for Afghanistan was what he called a comprehensive counterinsurgency campaign. We were going to pacify Afghanistan as we had ostensibly pacified Iraq, and then go on to pacify what? Pakistan? Alas, McChrystal flamed out, and despite General Allen's optimism, I'm not hearing very many people these days arguing that counterinsurgency on a global scale provides a formula for anything. Enter Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is, in essence, the new MO. The new MO is a policy of targeted assassination, in which we disregard considerations of national sovereignty. We act without any authorization on the part of Congress, basically employing drones or commandos to go kill anybody we want to kill that we perceive to be a threat to the United States of America. That's the Obama MO. That's Chapter 3. You know, I'm not a pacifist. I think that there are people who do pose a threat to us where there is really no alternative but to kill them. What I'm hard-pressed is to see how this policy of targeted assassination leads anywhere politically. I mean, how many people are we going to have to kill before we can finally say, okay, that's it, objective achieved, war over, we can call this thing off? And I look at the Israeli experience with targeted assassination, and that suggests to me that when you engage in that kind of a policy, really what you're going to do is end up having an endless list of targets. And I fear that's the path we have gone down. Now, the domestic political upside of targeted assassination is that, at least in an obvious sense, it doesn't cost quite so much. We don't have the high U.S. Casualty rate, and therefore the president sort of gets a free hand to do what he wants to do because the American people have gone back to sleep. And I think that describes precisely where we are in this regard.
Michael and then Linda.
Very quickly, I just want to say that the Chapter 4 that goes along with, that's the left flank of the strategic pivot that President Obama has announced, which is an expansion of naval power in Asia. So he's covering his rear, saying he's still fighting war on terror using the targeted assassination. But this is being accompanied by a naval buildup in an area facing China, which in my mind is not getting the attention that it deserves because potentially it's far more catastrophically dangerous.
Linda?
I was just going to say, obviously, drones and robotics are very appealing because the Pentagon is looking at exactly the same numbers that I was showing and trying to figure out how to, do things for less. But there are, a number of problems with drones, many of which that I've written about recently. I'll just mention a couple of them. One is the issue that because robotics are developing so quickly and many countries are working in this field, we are kind of entering a new era of a new arms race where drones will be proliferating very, very soon. And who is to say if we have 10,000 type A++ drones and China has 100,000 type B drones, which is better, sort of, which one is better. And we are sort of going into this era without seriously thinking it through because the technology is moving so quickly. Secondly, there are issues of accountability, and right now there are two drone programs. There is the traditional sort of defensive program for protecting our troops and surveillance in Afghanistan. There's also the offensive program controlled by the CIA, which includes the targeted assassinations and so forth. And that's a program with even less visibility and transparency and accountability than any other program. Third of all, there are the issues of the security and the integrity of the technology. There have already been enormous number of problems at the Creech facility in Nevada. There have been many questions about whether the drone that was brought down in Iran in December was intercepted by Iranian or other intelligence. And it's only a matter of time before a sort of secondary arms race develops in terms of intercepting drones of different powers. So this is something that's happening very rapidly and very quickly evolving, and it is unlikely to be the sort of panacea that it might seem initially.
I've got 5 people, and you, sir, first, please, in the front. I just add on drones one further thought, and that is this is not going to be limited to government use. There will be private transnational use of drones, and we may regret that we set a precedent for crossing borders without respect for sovereignty in our own case. Think of drug cartels with drones. Sir.
So my name is Richard Knobb, and I'm one of those bad retired military officers too. My question is for Linda. I like your analysis, but I was uncomfortable with your categorizations. And I think if you ask one of those bad old generals we've been talking about in the Pentagon, what his core military functions are, what is, I forget what you call them, yeah, core military functions, and you would strip out personnel. And I think, I'm just saying that's the way it appeared to me, okay? Because I think if you leave it in as the core military function in the age of volunteer army, where you recruit, retain with salaries, and take care of for health care and later on, then you highlight that as a problem that has to be dealt with rather than something separate from warfighting capability.
Well, first of all, I apologize if I wasn't clear. What I was differentiating was simply the TRICARE healthcare system within the overall defense budget. And if you look at that budget, which is right now about 8% of the defense budget, that will, if it keeps growing at the current rate, pretty soon be 20%, be 1/5 of the total overall Pentagon budget. And if you look at why that TRICARE system is growing so rapidly, it's because of enormously high utilization among the families of serving troops, children of serving troops, as well as the fact that guards who were not previously eligible are now eligible because of their service, as well as regular escalation of healthcare costs. It has gone to the point where before the wars, 45% of all of those who were eligible for TRICARE were using it, and now over 70% of all those who are eligible for TRICARE use it. The differential between what you pay for being covered through TRICARE versus any external health insurance program has grown so wide that you would be very hard-pressed, unless you were fairly affluent, not to participate in the system. The question is not whether that is a responsibility of the military. That the question is just that given that 20% of the defense budget in 5 years is going to be, under the current trends, devoted to military health care, how do we deal with that situation? What are the repercussions of that sort of fact?
I tell you what, write down on your notebook what your family pays per month for health coverage. Just write it down and look at it, and I'll write down what I pay for health care coverage as a retired military officer for my family, which you won't be able to see. And what I wrote is less than $40 a month, because what I pay is $115 per quarter in order to have coverage for me and my family, and if we still had children at home, it would cover children at home as well. Now, granted, we pay, I think it's $8 for a copay for medicine, and I think it's $12 for a copay for a doctor's visit, but that's an example of why this is such an enormous increasing cost factor.
But you have to consider your age group, mister. I pay $340, because after you go over 65, you have to join TRICARE B.
Well, down with socialized medicine. Do we have it in the back row?
Can I add one more thing on the TRICARE thing, and then I will be quiet, to this gentleman, which Joe Stiglitz and I have recently been working on, looking at who profited from the Iraq and Afghanistan war, who really earned the money. And the surprising biggest winners after oil producers were the 3 companies that make up the TRICARE system. TRICARE alone would be the number 6th biggest defense contractor if it were not broken up into 3 parts. And when you look at the underlying profitability, not just of these companies, and they have done very, very well, over the past 10 years. So, I mean, this is an area that absolutely has done well, kind of, and is not being scrutinized to the extent that we're looking at many other parts of the defense budget.
Thank you.
It's on.
Jonathan Granoff. I'm the president of the Global Security Institute, and I'm also a professor of international law at Widener Law School. And one of the reasons why the capital markets in the United States are robust is that people trust that we abide by the rule of law. The rule of law is very important domestically, and people take it seriously. But when I hear the whole debate about international security, particularly with respect to Iran, there's just an absolute dearth of reference to our treaty obligations under the United Nations Charter, a total ignoring that Article 6, Clause 2 of our Constitution makes our treaties the supreme law of the land. So there's this whole public discussion about the use of force without any reference to the checks and balances that we've instituted internationally, no less domestically. Now the cost, we haven't felt we're talking about anticipated costs. I believe the anticipated costs when the rest of the world stops trusting that the United States will abide by the rule of law are inestimable and catastrophic. So I would like something, some addressing of the importance and the value of the rule of law. My experience is people in the rest of the world, to some extent, have been inspired by this part of the American narrative, and now they're beginning to distrust it. And last but not least, under that category of treaties, the UN Charter, actually in Chapter 26, calls for demilitarization to free up resources for development. And amongst us here is is President Arias, who actually, when he chaired the Security Council, brought that to the fore. And there was no debate about fulfilling that treaty obligation.
Well, perhaps we've met the enemy and he's who we used to be. Who would like to comment? I think the comment is well taken. I don't know that it requires a rebuttal.
I do think that international law is going to have to be bolstered to address the sort of issues that I described, like offshore territorial disputes. The UN law on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea does not help us solve the East China Sea, South China Sea. An even bigger worry that maybe something we could all think about is transboundary water disputes, which I think as global climate change intensifies, particularly in areas North Africa, South Asia, Central Asia, the disputes over the Nile River, the Jordan River, Tigris, Euphrates are probably going to get much more fierce, and there's no way to adjudicate the distribution of these contested water river systems. This is an area where international law is going to be absolutely vital, a place where a lot of work can be done.
Sir?
My name is Mukhtar Ahmad Niazi. I am an independent researcher on Afghanistan. What do you think, will the U.S. pull out their troops before 2014 and stop investing on security and development projects in Afghanistan? And would it create another chance for Taliban to come to the power and create the mess that we had in 1990s? Thank you.
I'll just make one quick comment on that. I mean, I learned a few days ago that President Karzai has claimed that he's received pledges of upwards to $4 billion per year to pay for the Afghan forces to provide security for Afghanistan. I don't know if that's true or not, but this comes in the context, of course, of the forthcoming conference where the world's richest governments are also going to be asked to put up many more billions for development assistance. And I think the cup is going to be pretty empty if Mr. Karzai is correct that we're going to first pay for Afghan security not only through support of their armed forces, but of course there's going to be a continuing American presence there. That's clear. It's just not going to be a combat role, apparently. But there'll be a large, sizable presence there. That's that expense. All I'm saying is that there doesn't seem to be a lot more spending remaining out there for the development questions that you're pointing to. And those out there who might be most capable of providing some forms of development assistance or investment, I'm thinking of India or even China, well, I think they're waiting to see exactly what's going to shake out post-2014. So I guess all in all, I'm not very confident that you're going to see a significant shift in resources away from security and towards development in Afghanistan in any near-term scenario.
One has to raise serious questions about a strategy for extrication that presumes that the Afghan army will be funded at a rate that is a multiple of the total Afghan national budget, and that the United States will continue indefinitely to underwrite these costs in an atmosphere here of great pressure on budgets. We've seen this film before. It was called Vietnam, and therefore I think it's right to be a bit pessimistic about the prospects. Martin.
Thank you, Chaz. My name is Martin Lees. I'll be speaking later.
Hold it up a bit.
Yeah. I was very interested in Andrew Bacevich's recounting of chapters 1 to 4 in the evolution of military security, but we are here under the sign of chapter 11. What I'd like to say is that we've had a wonderful exposure to the problems of where we are and how we got here. But the purpose of this conference later on will also be to think how we might change this and where we're going. And in that sense, I'd like to ask such a distinguished panel, which is a rare opportunity, if they could say something about the drivers of US policy which have got us into this mess and which are keeping us there. Eisenhower, as everybody in this room will know, warned of the military-industrial complex, and we see the pressures on the Congress from all sorts of special interests, which are making it extremely difficult to do even the most obvious and intelligent things which we've heard today. So I wonder if anybody would like to comment on where the points of leverage might be to change the underlying forces which are driving the defense budget in this direction. Thank you.
Andrew, this is your topic.
Well, I mean, there is a military-industrial complex. Eisenhower was right. I think it is a mistake to exaggerate the influence of the military-industrial complex, although the president of Raytheon will get his phone call answered at the White House before I will get mine answered, that's for sure. I think that another factor, not unrelated, is the existence of a national security mindset, a national security apparatus, particularly in this city. We have large numbers of people who are deeply invested in military power, the projection of military power continuing to be our MO, that this is a source of institutional prerogative. It's a source of status. It's a source of thrills. I think I would include in that apparatus much of the mainstream media. You know, for reporters, there's no story more exciting to cover than a war, especially a war that sees American troops going into action. So we've got that mindset. But I think even beyond that, there is our collective sense of self-identity, frequently labeled American exceptionalism. The notion that we as a people, as a nation, do in fact stand apart. I mean, your point about why don't we do what we're committed to do under treaties with the UN? And the answer is because they don't apply to us. Haven't you figured that out? We give ourselves a waiver when it's convenient to do so. You know, why do we not acknowledge that we're in Chapter 11, that trillion-dollar deficits year after year are unsustainable, and therefore the imperative of learning to live within our means is indeed an American imperative. Why not? Because those rules don't apply to us. Maybe they apply to Greeks, but they don't apply to Americans. So in a sense, to wean ourselves, I think, away from this emphasis on military power, this conviction that we can kind of bend history to suit ourselves, would require for us to acknowledge that we are a people like every other people in history, that we cannot determine history's course, that the best we can do probably is to try to cope with the next surprise that's coming down the pike rather than pretending that we can shape the environment, as that one quote that I gave you. And that's something that as a people we're reluctant to do. It's part of our DNA, that we're special, that we're different, that we're called upon, that we're chosen. And of course, it's a false notion, but it's also one that then is continually reinforced by our political leaders. I mean, just check the rhetoric of Governor Romney in particular, not to pick on him, but Governor Romney insisting that the next century will be, must be, elect me, and I guarantee it will be an American century, as if the facts of the matter simply are irrelevant, wishing it will make it come true. And we're complicit in that, I think, as a people.
Linda, unfunded obligations, disinvestment in the civilian side of government, how does that tie in with moving toward non-military solutions to problems that are less expensive to implement than military ones?
You know, I'm going to sound like a broken record talking about boring accounting systems. But everyone anywhere in the world, you know, who's looked at is it better, is there a way to get better control over where money goes? Looks first at how you track the systems for tracking, for accountability and transparency over where money is spent. And there are many organizations that I've been involved with, large cities that have really gotten religion around this issue and have transformed their ability so that they're not just kind of doing things cheaper by doing them worse, but they're actually getting better outcomes for the same amount of money. Now, you see attempts all over the world to go in this direction, sort of performance budgeting and things like this. In the new budget in the UK, they're pledging to sort of give people a receipt with their taxes to show where their money has gone. Now, you have the complete opposite end of the spectrum right now at the Pentagon, so that if, for example, if what Bates said was true, that we were spending $4 billion a year, some multiple of the economy in Afghanistan to support the police and armed forces over the next 10 years, you wouldn't be able to find that out without a PhD in public finance in 3 months. It would be buried in thousands of individual line items. So, I mean, Joe Stiglitz and I, in looking at this for years, came to the conclusion that the impact of this is that we are making military interventions, making wars seem much, much cheaper than they are. If someone offers me a car for $20,000 and it's actually going to cost me $80,000, I might make a different decision if I knew it was going to cost me 4 times as much. And every single time that our Congress votes on every single one of these war appropriations, and they funded the war through more than 30 individual so-called emergency appropriations, they are basically not voting on anything like what it's going to cost. Now, you multiply this times with the complexity of having 4 individual forces, of having, in the case of Afghanistan, all of the NATO apparatus. I mean, until you bring visibility in, I mean, that is the kind of single most easy, in a way, because it's not rocket science. It's basic cost accounting and perseverance, to changing the way we're able to account for what we spend. And I obviously, an evangelist on this topic, but the reason I am is because this is not Middle East peace. This is something that actually should be a country like us that is a wealthy country with these resources and the knowledge that we should be able to achieve.
We've basically run out of time. Michael, briefly, and
briefly.
Bates, you have anything to add?
Just you in your comments spoke about an enemy deficit. And to sustain all of this will require an enemy. And there is a very big industry in this town that is busily creating that enemy, and the enemy is called China. So I'm very glad we have a panel on this tomorrow. And I think that the Obama administration is succumbing to this pressure by the new defense policy is very much oriented to containing China. And once we go down that path, the military-industrial complex will be rich for decades to come. So combating the creation of China as a new enemy is going to be the most important single thing we could do to avert all of the above.
You remind me that tomorrow when I speak on China, I should address the search for Dr. Fu Manchu as the evil genius who's guiding Chinese policy. We have run out of time. I apologize to everyone who wanted to make a comment or ask a question and was unable to do so, but I hope you'll join me in thanking both the panel and the audience.